November 3rd, 1943. Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville. Corporal Takeshi Yamada crouched behind a fallen palm tree, ears ringing from the continuous thunder that had dominated the last 6 hours of combat. Through the smoke and vegetation, he could see the American positions 400 meters distant. What terrified him was not the distance, it was the sound. Every Japanese soldier in the Pacific had learned to distinguish the sharp crack of rifle fire, the stuttering bursts of light machine guns, the deeper hammering of heavy weapons, but the Americans possessed something else entirely, a weapon that didn't just fire, it roared. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, mechanical bellow that punched through all other noise on the battlefield. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun. Yamada had first heard this weapon 2 days earlier, when his regiment attempted to probe American beach defenses. 3 squads advanced through the jungle in textbook formation, maintaining dispersion, using cover properly. Then the sound began. Not the rapid chatter of typical machine guns, but a slower, heavier rhythm. Each shot sounded like a small cannon. Within 30 seconds, all 3 squads had been shattered. Men didn't just fall when hit by this weapon, they came apart. Yamada watched a sergeant 20 meters ahead simply disintegrate from the waist up when a burst struck him. Another soldier dove behind a coconut palm trunk 30 centimeters thick and was killed anyway. The rounds punched completely through the tree and through the man behind it. That night, survivors gathered in a shell crater to compare what they had witnessed. Every man described the same horror, the impossible power of a weapon that seemed to ignore all conventional cover. Lieutenant Ishikawa, who had fought in China for 2 years, spoke words that would haunt Yamada for the remainder of his life. The Americans have created a weapon that makes infantry tactics obsolete. We were trained to use terrain, to hide behind trees and earthworks. This gun shoots through all of it. How do we fight an enemy whose bullets cannot be stopped? The question had no answer, but it captured what Japanese infantry across the Pacific theater were discovering. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun represented something fundamentally different from any weapon they had encountered. It was not simply a scaled-up machine gun. It was a weapon that changed the mathematics of infantry combat in ways that made Japanese tactical doctrine dangerously obsolete. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Browning M2 entered American service in 1933, the product of nearly 15 years of development by legendary firearms designer John Moses Browning. The United States military wanted a heavy machine gun capable of defeating light armor and aircraft, while providing long-range suppressive fire. What they received exceeded every specification. The M2 fired the 50 BMG cartridge Browning machine gun, a round originally designed for anti-tank rifles during World War I. The cartridge measured 5.45 inches in total length and weighed approximately 4 ounces. The bullet itself weighed between 660 and 750 grains depending on type, roughly 10 times heavier than a standard rifle bullet. When fired, this massive projectile left the barrel at velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. The kinetic energy delivered on target exceeded 13,000 foot-pounds at the muzzle, approximately 35 times the energy of a standard rifle round. This raw power produced effects on human targets that Japanese soldiers found incomprehensible and terrifying. Japanese infantry training in the 1930s and early 1940s emphasized cover and concealment. Soldiers learned to use terrain features, vegetation, and field fortifications to protect themselves from rifle and machine gun fire. Standard doctrine held that a man protected by a tree trunk, an earthen berm, or a log bunker enjoyed substantial protection from enemy fire. This doctrine worked adequately against conventional weapons. A rifle bullet could be stopped by 18 inches of earth, a foot of wood, or even heavy vegetation. Japanese light machine guns like the Type 96 fired the 6.5mm cartridge, which could be defeated by even less substantial cover. Japanese soldiers learned to trust their cover. The Browning M2 made that trust lethal. The 50 caliber round could penetrate 45 inches of concrete, 13 inches of armor plate at close range, or drive completely through multiple tree trunks before losing effectiveness. When Japanese soldiers took cover behind what their training taught them was adequate protection, the M2 simply shot through. Private First Class Hideo Tanaka, captured on Saipan in June 1944, described his unit's first encounter with the weapon during interrogation. His testimony was filed with American intelligence and later declassified. "We were positioned in earthwork fortifications that had protected us from American rifle fire for 2 days. Then the Americans brought forward their large machine gun. We thought we were safe behind our earthworks. The first burst killed 3 men. The bullets came through 1 meter of packed earth as if it were not there. We could hear the bullets passing through the soil, a strange whistling sound. Then men died. We abandoned the position because it provided no protection." This penetration capability derived from the projectile's design as much as its velocity. The M2 fired several ammunition types, but the most common against infantry positions was ball ammunition with a steel core. The aerodynamic shape and heavy weight allowed the bullet to retain energy over distance while the steel core maintained structural integrity during penetration. Japanese officers attempting to defend against M2-equipped American positions quickly realized that conventional field fortifications were inadequate. Lieutenant Saburo Watanabe, an engineering officer captured on Peleliu in September 1944, provided detailed analysis during post-war interrogation about defensive position construction. "We discovered that defenses adequate against rifle fire failed completely against the 50 caliber weapon. Logs required to be stacked 3 deep, creating embrasures nearly 1 meter thick. Earthworks needed to exceed 2 meters in depth. Concrete bunkers required steel reinforcement. These requirements exceeded the construction capacity of most defensive positions, especially on islands where building materials were limited. The result was that many positions that should have protected troops were death traps. The Americans positioned their 50 caliber guns to fire into our defenses from angles where our protection was weakest. The M2's effectiveness wasn't limited to penetration. The weapon's psychological impact derived equally from what happened when its bullets struck human targets. Japanese soldiers across the Pacific Theater reported casualties unlike anything they had witnessed with conventional weapons. Corporal Kenji Matsuda, who survived fighting on Guadalcanal before being evacuated due to wounds received on New Georgia, wrote in a diary later captured by American forces, "The American heavy machine gun does not wound men, it destroys them. I watched soldiers hit by this weapon. They do not fall cleanly. Parts of their bodies are torn away. Men struck in the torso are often cut completely in half. A round that strikes a limb removes that limb entirely. There is no possibility of treating these wounds. Death is instantaneous or occurs within seconds from shock and blood loss." Medical personnel treating casualties confirmed these observations. Japanese military doctors noted that wounds from 50 caliber rounds were almost universally fatal. The massive temporary wound cavity created by the bullet's passage through tissue destroyed internal organs far beyond the projectile's actual path. Shock waves from the bullet's passage caused catastrophic damage to blood vessels, bone, and soft tissue throughout the body. Unlike wounds from rifle bullets, which might be survivable with prompt medical treatment, 50 caliber wounds overwhelmed the body's capacity to survive trauma. Japanese medical doctrine had no treatment protocols for such injuries because there was no realistic prospect of survival. Soldiers hit by M2 fire were simply listed as killed in action. The distinction between wounded and killed became meaningless. This lethality extended beyond direct hits. The M2's bullets created dangerous secondary effects that multiplied casualties. When rounds struck trees, they produced massive splinter clouds that wounded everyone nearby. When they hit rock or concrete, fragmentation created deadly shrapnel zones. Bullets striking metal equipment or weapons produced fragments that turned into high-velocity projectiles. Japanese infantry learned that being near an M2's target was nearly as dangerous as being the target itself. Sergeant Yoshi Takahashi, captured on Tarawa in November 1943 after 3 days of brutal fighting, described the weapon's area effect. The large machine gun does not kill only the man it aims at. When bullets strike our positions, they create storms of splinters, fragments, and debris. Men are wounded by pieces of their own fortifications. We discovered that the gun could kill soldiers inside bunkers by firing at the bunker's entrance. The bullets would fragment upon impact and fill the interior with shrapnel. There was no safe place within range of this weapon. The M2's effective range compounded every other advantage. American doctrine employed the weapon at ranges up to 2,000 meters against area targets, though aimed fire was effective to approximately 1,800 meters. This range exceeded Japanese infantry weapons by factors that made counterfire nearly impossible. The standard Japanese infantry rifle, the Type 38 Arisaka, had an effective range of approximately 500 meters against point targets. The Type 96 light machine gun could engage targets to 600 meters. The Type 92 heavy machine gun, Japan's closest equivalent to the M2, had an effective range of approximately 800 meters, but fired the much less powerful 6.5mm cartridge. When American positions included M2 machine guns, they could engage Japanese forces at ranges where Japanese weapons could not effectively return fire. This created killing zones where Japanese infantry could be decimated without being able to suppress or destroy the source of fire. Lieutenant Toshiro Yamamoto, a platoon leader captured on Kwajalein in February 1944, analyzed this tactical dilemma in testimony provided to American intelligence officers. The American .50 caliber gun controls all terrain within 2 kilometers. When Americans establish positions with these weapons, we cannot approach without suffering massive casualties. Our machine guns cannot reach their positions. Our rifles are useless at such ranges. We must either call artillery, which we rarely have, or attempt to close the distance under fire. Closing distance against a weapon that can kill at 2,000 meters means crossing 2,000 meters of killing ground. Most units are destroyed before getting within range to return effective fire. American forces exploited this range advantage ruthlessly. Standard practice positioned M2 machine guns on dominant terrain where they could observe and engage approaching Japanese forces at maximum range. The weapons were typically employed in pairs or groups of 4, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered all approaches to American positions. Japanese infantry advancing against such defenses found themselves under fire from weapons they could not see and could not engage. The M2's muzzle flash was visible at night, but locating the exact firing position during daylight proved extremely difficult at long range. By the time Japanese units closed to rifle range, they had already suffered crippling casualties from M2 fire. The psychological effect of being killed by an unseen weapon at ranges beyond your ability to retaliate cannot be overstated. Japanese infantry trained to close with the enemy and engage in decisive combat instead found themselves dying in open ground, unable to fight back, unable to retreat, unable to do anything except die under fire from a weapon that seemed omnipotent. Corporal Takeshi Yamada, whose encounter with the M2 on Bougainville began this story, survived the war, and provided extensive interviews to Japanese military historians in the 1970s. His description of infantry tactics against M2-equipped positions captures the sense of helplessness Japanese soldiers felt. We knew the Americans had positioned their large machine guns covering the approaches to their lines. We could not see them, but we could hear them firing at other units. The sound carried across the battlefield, slower than a normal machine gun, each shot distinct, powerful. When our company was ordered to attack, every man understood we were being ordered to die. There was no tactical solution. We could not suppress the guns. We could not avoid them. We could only advance until we were killed, or until we reached American trenches. Most units were destroyed in the first 200 meters of their advance. The survivors who somehow crossed the killing zone arrived at American positions, disorganized, depleted, and facing fresh defenders with automatic weapons. It was slaughter disguised as tactics. The tactical superiority the M2 provided to American infantry was only one dimension of its effectiveness. Japanese forces discovered that the weapon's versatility made it lethal across multiple domains of warfare. What infantry feared on the ground, pilots feared in the air, and vehicle crews feared from American defensive positions. The M2 had been designed partially as an anti-aircraft weapon, and in this role it proved devastatingly effective against Japanese aircraft. Unlike dedicated anti-aircraft guns that required specialized crews and complex fire control systems, the M2 could be operated by standard infantry and employed against ground or air targets interchangeably. American units throughout the Pacific mounted M2 machine guns on improvised anti-aircraft mounts, often simply swiveling tripods that allowed the weapon to traverse and elevate freely. When Japanese aircraft approached at low altitude to strafe or bomb American positions, they flew directly into fields of .50 caliber fire that could destroy aircraft with just a few hits. Japanese pilots quickly learned to fear American positions defended by M2 machine guns. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most successful fighter pilots who survived the war, described the threat in his memoir published in 1957. American ground forces possessed heavy machine guns that could destroy our aircraft with terrifying ease. Flying low over American positions was suicidal. The .50 caliber rounds would tear through our aircraft's thin aluminum skin, destroy engines, ignite fuel tanks, or kill the pilot instantly. I witnessed aircraft hit by ground fire simply disintegrate in mid-air. Other aircraft caught fire and fell burning into the jungle. The Americans fired these weapons in such volume that avoiding them was nearly impossible at low altitude. The lethality stemmed from the projectile's ability to defeat aircraft structures that provided no meaningful people-fought protection. Japanese fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0 prioritized speed and maneuverability over armor protection. The Zero's fuselage skin measured less than 1 millimeter thick in most areas. The wings were even thinner, constructed of fabric over aluminum frames in some sections. A .50 caliber round striking such an aircraft passed through without meaningful resistance, often continuing through the aircraft and exiting the opposite side. If the bullet struck the engine, it could destroy critical components, shatter the crankcase, or sever fuel lines. If it struck a fuel tank which were not self-sealing on early Japanese aircraft, the tank would rupture and often ignite. If it struck the pilot, death was instantaneous. Flight Petty Officer Yoshio Fukui, shot down over Guadalcanal in October 1942 and captured after swimming ashore, described being hit by M2 fire during his interrogation. I was making a strafing run against American positions at approximately per day, 100 meters altitude. I saw the tracers rising toward my aircraft. They appeared to move slowly, but arrived with tremendous speed. The first round struck my engine cowling, and I heard a tremendous bang as the engine began to shake violently. The second round passed through the cockpit, just behind my seat. The third struck my left wing and tore a hole the size of a man's head. The aircraft became uncontrollable. I barely managed to crash land in the water offshore. The Americans' ground fire was more dangerous than their fighter aircraft because you could not evade it. Once you committed to an attack run, you were exposed for several seconds. That was enough time for their gunners to destroy your aircraft. American forces exploited this vulnerability systematically. By 1943, standard defensive doctrine for American positions included multiple M2 machine guns positioned specifically for anti-aircraft defense. These weapons were loaded with a mixture of ball, armor-piercing, and incendiary ammunition in specific ratios, typically 4 ball rounds to 1 armor-piercing to 1 incendiary, loaded in alternating sequence. The incendiary rounds proved particularly effective against Japanese aircraft. When an incendiary round struck a fuel tank, it ignited the fuel, turning the aircraft into a flying torch. Japanese pilots reported that being hit by incendiary ammunition was a death sentence. The fires spread too quickly to extinguish, and pilots had mere seconds to abandon their aircraft before being burned alive. Petty Officer Hiroshi Nishizawa, another highly decorated Japanese pilot who survived the war, described watching squadron mates shot down by ground fire during the Solomon Islands campaign. "We lost more pilots to American ground fire than to enemy fighters during some operations. The Americans positioned their heavy machine guns in groups of 4 or 8 weapons. When we approached to attack, all weapons would open fire, simultaneously. The volume of fire was so intense that aircraft were hit multiple times within seconds. I watched pilots I had flown with for years, simply blown apart in their cockpits. Others crashed, burning into the jungle. The Americans were very accurate with these weapons. They led their targets properly and maintained fire discipline. It was not random firing, it was precise, deadly shooting. The M2's effectiveness against aircraft increased as American gunners gained experience. By 1944, veteran units could reliably engage aircraft at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, leading targets appropriately and concentrating fire from multiple weapons onto single aircraft. Japanese pilots attempting to support ground operations or conduct reconnaissance found themselves flying through walls of 50 caliber fire that few aircraft could survive. The psychological toll on Japanese aviators was severe. Unlike air-to-air combat, where pilot skill, aircraft performance, and tactical awareness determined survival, flying over American ground positions required accepting that you might be killed by ground fire regardless of your abilities. Experienced pilots with dozens of victories could be killed by a well-aimed burst from a ground-based weapon operated by an infantryman with minimal training. This psychological burden compounded the physical dangers Japanese pilots faced. Flight training already suffered from fuel shortages, reduced instructor availability, and shortened courses. Pilots arriving at frontline units had minimal experience. They then faced American air superiority, superior American aircraft, and the knowledge that even if they survived enemy fighters, ground fire from M2 machine guns could kill them during any low-altitude operation. The result was a progressive degradation of Japanese air operations effectiveness. Pilots flew higher to avoid ground fire, reducing their accuracy against ground targets. They shortened their attack runs, decreasing their effectiveness. They avoided areas known to contain heavy anti-aircraft defenses, limiting their ability to support ground forces. The M2, while not a dedicated anti-aircraft weapon, functioned so effectively in this role that it materially degraded Japanese air operations throughout the Pacific Theater. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The M2's versatility extended beyond anti-personnel and anti-aircraft roles. Japanese forces discovered that the weapon could defeat light armored vehicles and fortifications that were supposedly protected against small arms fire. This capability proved particularly devastating during Japanese counterattacks against American positions. Japanese armor in the Pacific Theater consisted primarily of light tanks like the Type 95, Hago, and medium tanks like the Type 97 Chi-Ha. These vehicles were designed for infantry support operations against opponents with limited anti-tank capabilities. Their armor protection reflected this design philosophy, adequate against rifle fire and shell fragments, but vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank weapons. The Type 95 Hago, the most common Japanese tank in the Pacific, had maximum armor thickness of 12 mm on the front hull and turret. Side armor measured 8 to 10 mm. Rear armor was 6 mm. The Type 97 Chi-Ha was only marginally better protected, with 25 mm of frontal armor and 20 mm on the sides. Against conventional infantry weapons, these tanks provided adequate protection. Japanese armor had proven effective in China against opponents lacking modern anti-tank weapons. Japanese tank crews had developed confidence in their vehicles' protection and aggressive tactics, emphasizing close support of infantry. The M2 destroyed that confidence completely. Armor-piercing 50 caliber ammunition could penetrate 12 mm of armor plate at ranges exceeding 800 meters. Against the side and rear armor of Japanese tanks, the M2 was effective at over 1,000 meters. American infantry equipped with M2 machine guns could destroy Japanese tanks at ranges where the tank's weapons could barely engage effectively. Tank Commander Sergeant Kazuo Tamura, captured on Saipan in July 1944 after his Type 97 tank was disabled, provided detailed testimony about M2 effectiveness against armor. "We were trained that our tanks were protected against enemy machine gun fire. This was true against normal machine guns. The American 50 caliber weapon was different. During our attack against American positions, we advanced with 6 tanks. The Americans allowed us to close to approximately 600 meters, then opened fire with their large machine guns. The first tank was hit multiple times and caught fire. The crew died inside. The second tank had its tracks destroyed and was immobilized. My tank was struck in the engine compartment. The rounds penetrated completely and destroyed the engine. We were forced to abandon the vehicle. The 6th tank retreated. All of this occurred in less than 2 minutes. We never reached the American trenches. Our tanks were destroyed by machine gun fire before we could employ our main guns effectively." The vulnerability of Japanese armor to M2 fire forced tactical changes that reduced armor effectiveness. Tank commanders learned to avoid exposing their vehicles to American positions at any range where M2 fire could be effective. This meant attacking only when supported by overwhelming artillery preparation, using terrain to mask approaches, and closing to minimum range as quickly as possible to reduce exposure time. These tactics reduced Japanese armor's flexibility and effectiveness. Tanks that should have provided mobile firepower and shock action instead had to approach cautiously, limiting their impact. American infantry, equipped with M2 machine guns, could hold defensive positions against Japanese armor that would have been vulnerable to tanks in any other theater. The M2's effectiveness against fortifications proved equally devastating to Japanese defensive preparations. Throughout the Pacific, Japanese forces constructed elaborate defensive positions designed to withstand naval bombardment and aerial attack. These positions featured reinforced concrete bunkers, interconnected tunnels, and carefully camouflaged firing positions. Against conventional infantry weapons, these fortifications worked as designed. Rifle fire could not penetrate the firing slits. Light machine guns could suppress defenders but not destroy positions. American infantry attacking fortified Japanese positions without heavy weapons support suffered severe casualties. The M2 changed this equation fundamentally. The weapon could engage fortified positions at ranges beyond Japanese weapons' effective reach, could penetrate the embrasures and firing slits of bunkers, and could destroy the structures themselves with sustained fire. Private First Class Tadashi Ogawa, who survived the defense of Tarawa in November 1943 before being captured, described M2 effectiveness against fortifications during his interrogation. Our bunkers were constructed with coconut logs reinforced with steel rails and concrete. The walls were 1 meter thick. We believed we were safe from anything except direct hits from naval guns or bombs. The Americans brought their .50 caliber machine guns forward to within 200 meters of our positions. They fired continuously at our bunker embrasures. The rounds destroyed the coconut logs, penetrated the concrete, and filled the interior of the bunker with fragments. Men were killed inside positions that were supposed to protect them. The bunker walls began to collapse under sustained fire. After 30 minutes of continuous firing, the bunker was no longer defensible. We had to evacuate or be buried alive. This was a machine gun destroying a fortification designed to survive bombardment. It seemed impossible, but we watched it happen. The M2's ability to destroy fortifications derived from sustained fire, delivering massive kinetic energy to specific points on structures. A single .50 caliber round might crack concrete or splinter wood. 100 rounds striking the same area would progressively destroy any field fortification not specifically designed to resist such punishment. American tactical doctrine exploited this capability. When encountering fortified Japanese positions, American infantry would position multiple M2 machine guns to deliver sustained fire against specific portions of the fortification, typically the firing embrasures, entrance points, or structural weak points identified through observation. The psychological effect on defenders was devastating. Japanese soldiers inside bunkers experienced the terror of watching their protection progressively destroyed. The continuous impact of .50 caliber rounds created unbearable noise. Concrete fragments filled the interior space. Dust made breathing difficult. The structure itself began to shake and crack under the sustained hammering. Defenders faced an impossible choice: remain in the bunker and risk being buried alive when it collapsed, or evacuate into American fire and be killed in the open. Either choice meant death or capture. The weapon that was supposed to be merely a heavy machine gun had become a tool for destroying fortifications that required artillery to defeat. By 1944, Japanese defensive planning acknowledged M2 effectiveness against standard fortifications. Engineering guidelines circulated to garrison forces specified that bunkers must be constructed with minimum 2-meter thick walls of reinforced concrete or multiple layers of coconut logs separated by earth, filled to survive .50 caliber fire. Embrasures had to be designed with sharp angles preventing direct fire into the interior. Entrance points required to be protected by multiple right-angle turns. These requirements exceeded the construction capacity of most garrison forces. Building materials, especially steel reinforcement and cement, were limited on island garrisons. Labor was insufficient to construct fortifications to these specifications across entire defensive perimeters. The result was that many positions remained vulnerable to M2 fire despite Japanese awareness of the threat. Lieutenant Saburo Nakagawa, engineering officer on Peleliu who survived the battle and was captured in late November 1944, explained the dilemma in post-war testimony. We knew what was required to protect positions against American .50 caliber weapons. We lacked the resources to build such fortifications for more than a few key positions. The majority of our defenses were constructed to lesser standards because we had no alternative. We knew these positions would be vulnerable, but we built them anyway, hoping they would provide some protection and delay the American advance. The .50 caliber weapons destroyed these positions methodically, one after another. What we knew would happen, happened. We were powerless to prevent it. The combination of anti-personnel, anti-aircraft, anti-armor, and anti-fortification capabilities made the M2 the most feared infantry weapon in the Japanese military's experience. No other weapon system operated by American infantry provided such versatility and lethality across such a broad spectrum of targets. Japanese soldiers learned to identify M2 positions by sound and prioritize them as targets when possible. Intelligence briefings distributed to Japanese garrison forces throughout 1944 and 1945 specifically addressed the M2 threat and provided guidance for countering it. One such document, captured on Okinawa in May 1945, provided remarkably candid assessment of the weapon and Japanese inability to effectively counter it. The document stated, "The American .50 caliber machine gun is their most effective infantry weapon. It can kill our soldiers through cover that would stop normal bullets. It can destroy our aircraft at ranges where our pilots cannot effectively return fire. It can penetrate our tanks' armor. It can destroy our fortifications. There is no effective counter to this weapon except to destroy it before it can be employed. This requires artillery fire, which we rarely have available, or infantry assault under covering fire, which results in severe casualties. In most situations, positions defended by .50 caliber weapons cannot be taken by infantry assault without unacceptable losses. If attack is necessary, it must be conducted at night when the weapon's range advantage is reduced, from multiple directions simultaneously, to divide their fire, and with acceptance that casualties will be heavy. There is no method to attack such positions without significant loss of life." The document's resignation captured what Japanese infantry across the Pacific had learned through bitter experience. The M2 represented a qualitative advantage that Japanese forces could not match or effectively counter with available weapons and tactics. The weapon's presence on the battlefield fundamentally altered tactical calculations in America's favor. Corporal Takeshi Yamada, whose story opened this narrative, survived the Bougainville campaign and was eventually evacuated to Rabaul in early 1944 as American forces bypassed and isolated the garrison. He remained at Rabaul until Japan's surrender in August 1945, never seeing combat again but living with the memories of what he had witnessed. In a 1978 interview with Japanese military historians, Yamada reflected on the weapon's psychological impact. "Caliber machine gun taught us that we could not win. Every advantage we believed we possessed, our fighting spirit, our willingness to die, our tactical training. None of it mattered when the Americans could kill us through our cover from ranges where we could not fight back. The weapon was not simply more powerful than our machine guns. It was a different class of weapon entirely. Fighting against it felt like fighting with swords against rifles. The technological gap was so large that courage became irrelevant. You could be the bravest soldier in the Imperial Army, perfectly trained, absolutely committed to victory. The .50 caliber gun would kill you anyway, from a distance, through whatever you hid behind, before you could even see the man who killed you. How do you maintain morale when every man knows this? How do you order soldiers to attack positions they cannot possibly take? The .50 caliber machine gun broke something in us that no amount of propaganda could repair. It was physical proof that we were technologically inferior and that this inferiority would kill us regardless of our spirit or determination. The statistical record supports Yamada's assessment. American forces employed approximately 40,000 M2 machine guns throughout the Pacific theater by war's end. These weapons were present at every major engagement from Guadalcanal in 1942 to Okinawa in 1945. While precise casualty attribution is impossible, battlefield records rarely specify which weapon killed which soldier. Estimates based on post-battle assessments and Japanese survivor testimony suggest that M2 machine guns accounted for between 15 and 20% of Japanese infantry casualties in ground combat, a remarkably high percentage for a weapon that represented less than 1% of American infantry firearms. Against Japanese aircraft, M2 guns were credited with hundreds of confirmed kills and probable kills throughout the war. Against Japanese armor, the weapon destroyed or disabled scores of tanks across multiple campaigns. Against fortifications, M2 fire enabled American infantry to reduce defensive positions that would otherwise have required artillery or air support to defeat. The weapon's production numbers reflected American industrial capacity that Japan could not match. Browning Arms Company, along with other licensed manufacturers, produced approximately 3 million M2 machine guns between 1933 and 1945. This included guns for ground use, aircraft armament, and vehicle mounting. Production reached approximately 15,000 units per month by 1944. Japan possessed no equivalent weapon. The closest analogue was the Type 92 heavy machine gun, which fired the 6.5mm cartridge and was effective to approximately 800 meters. While a capable weapon, it lacked the M2's range, penetration, and versatility. Japanese attempts to develop a true .50 caliber equivalent never progressed beyond prototype stages. Industrial capacity was insufficient to produce such weapons in meaningful numbers, even if designs had been perfected. This technological and industrial disparity manifested in countless tactical situations where American forces possessed capabilities Japanese forces simply could not match. The M2 was merely one weapon among many that demonstrated this gap, but its ubiquity and versatility made it perhaps the most visible symbol of American material superiority. Japanese soldiers who survived the war and returned home carried memories of the weapon that had hunted them across the Pacific. For decades after the war, veterans' accounts consistently identified the M2 as the American weapon they feared most. The sound of the gun, that distinctive, heavy hammering that carried across battlefields, became associated with death in ways that rifle, fire, or artillery never quite matched. The personal nature of the threat contributed to this psychological impact. Artillery killed impersonally, randomly. You survived artillery by being lucky, by being somewhere else when shells landed. The M2 killed deliberately. Someone aimed that weapon at you specifically, tracked you as you moved, and fired knowing each round would kill you if it hit. The weapon's accuracy meant that cover which might have saved you from artillery or random fire would not save you from aimed M2 fire. Death was personal, deliberate, and nearly inevitable if you were targeted. Private First Class Hideo Suzuki, captured on Iwo Jima in March 1945, after being wounded and unable to retreat with his unit, described the experience of being targeted by M2 fire during his interrogation. I was moving between positions when the American machine gun found me. I heard the sound, everyone knew that sound, and I dove behind a boulder. The first round struck the boulder, and I felt the impacts through the stone. I knew the gun would penetrate eventually, so I tried to move to better cover. As soon as I moved, the fire followed me. I made it perhaps 5 meters before being hit in the leg. The bullet destroyed my knee completely. I fell and could not move. The gunner could have killed me. I was lying in the open. Instead, the fire shifted to other targets. Perhaps I was no longer a threat. Perhaps the gunner was merciful. I do not know, but I remember lying there, bleeding, waiting to see if the gun would come back to finish me. That sound continued for hours. Every time I heard it, I thought it was coming for me. Even now, 53 years later, loud noises make me freeze. I hear that sound in my dreams. The 50 caliber machine gun was death incarnate, personal, deliberate, and unstoppable. The M2 continued service long after World War II ended, seeing action in every American conflict through the present day. The basic design has remained virtually unchanged since 1933, a testament to John Moses Browning's engineering genius. The weapon's effectiveness, proven so thoroughly against Japanese forces in the Pacific, ensured its place as the standard heavy machine gun for American forces and dozens of allied nations. For Japanese veterans, the weapon's continued service provided a strange footnote to their experiences. The gun that had terrorized them across the Pacific became a symbol of the American-Japanese alliance formed after the war. Japan's self-defense forces eventually adopted the M2, operating the same weapon that had killed so many Japanese soldiers decades earlier. Former Corporal Takeshi Yamada, in his final interview before his death in 1989, reflected on this irony. I spent 50 years trying to forget the sound of the 50 caliber machine gun. Then I attended a self-defense force demonstration and heard it again. Young Japanese soldiers were firing the same weapon that had killed my friends, my officers, so many good men. The sound was exactly the same. I recognized it immediately even after so many years. Part of me wanted to leave. Part of me felt anger that we now used the weapon that had defeated us. But mostly I felt sadness. The gun was not evil, it was just a tool. The men who fired it at us were not evil, they were soldiers like us, following orders, doing their duty. The war was evil. The decisions that led to war were evil. The gun was just very, very good at its purpose, which was killing. And we were on the wrong end of it. That was our tragedy. We fought with courage and died with honor, but we died because we faced enemies with better weapons, better industry, better resources. The 50 caliber machine gun was simply the most visible proof of our inevitable defeat. Every soldier who heard that sound knew the war was lost. Some of us lived to remember it. Most did not. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your S-Pose. Screen now and don't forget to subscribe.